Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a really profound challenge. We're looking at a stack of source material that asks some fundamental questions about the main assumptions guiding American foreign policy right now. If you listen to the conversation in Washington, D.C., you hear these two phrases everywhere: strategic competition and great power. They sound so current, so necessary for the 21st century.
And what's so striking about that language right away is that it has this distinctly 19th century vintage. These are not new ideas. And as Jackson and Brenes argue in the Rivalry Peril, that vintage is, well, it's laced with some deep structural danger.
That's such a crucial point. The authors are basically saying that this whole American obsession with great power competition, targeting China, sometimes Russia, it didn't come out of nowhere. It grew directly from the failures of the War on Terror. The U.S. spent 2 decades, trillions of dollars on these asymmetric wars. And instead of a real hard look at what went wrong in Iraq or Afghanistan, the political class just sort of found a cleaner, older enemy. The pivot to Asia became the new easy direction.
Absolutely. And when that shift was first happening, around 2011 with Hillary Clinton, the official line was actually pretty optimistic. The hope was that you could outcompete China without it turning into, outright hostility.
Right. Fair competition.
Fair competition,
Yeah.
exactly. The messaging was all about how both countries had much more to gain from cooperation than from conflict. It was all framed as this constructive, manageable rivalry.
But the central argument in this work just blows that optimism apart. We hear it all the time in Washington, this idea that GPC is a shortcut to American renewal.
Yeah.
That it'll help us clean up our own house, boost our economy, get our strength back. But the authors say, no, great power competition is not a productive path. It's actually a profound and active threat.
Precisely. And so our mission today is to really dig into that. We're going to unpack the 3 main areas where this rivalry poses a really severe peril. We have to look at the history, how the whole thing rests on this airbrushed, moralistic view of the Cold War.
Okay.
Then we have to look at what it's doing domestically, how GPC is actively weakening American democracy and our economic stability. And then finally, globally, how it just inherently ramps up the risk to peace.
And to really get a handle on the danger today, we have to start where they start, which is challenging the history we all think we know. I'm fascinated by this idea that we're operating under this skewed, moralistic view of the past, and that we can't see the present clearly until we correct it.
Let's set the stage then. Great power competition isn't some post-9/11 invention. It's not even just a Cold War thing. It's basically endemic to history. It's been shaping global markets and states since at least the 18th century.
So like England versus France.
England versus France is the classic example. In the 1700s, they were constantly at war. And it wasn't about ideology, not really. It was about colonies, trade routes, access to markets in Asia and Africa. Competition was just the default setting for building an empire.
So when diplomacy happened back then, it wasn't about trying to end the rivalry. It was more about managing the chaos the rivalry was causing.
Exactly right. You look at these huge agreements like the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 or the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after Napoleon was defeated. These diplomatic efforts, they were all about achieving stability, not peace, and certainly not global justice.
Stability for whom, though?
Stability for the great powers themselves. That was the whole point. These treaties created a balance of power, a mechanism where the big European empires could agree on this uneasy arrangement. And the whole point of that arrangement was to maintain the imperial order. So it actively held back rising nationalism. It suppressed independence movements in the colonies. It was a deeply conservative political project, all designed to stop another massive war among the elites. But it didn't deliver peace or justice to, the rest of the world.
And the ultimate catastrophic failure of that whole system was, of course, World War I. This whole tangled web of alliances just spiraled into this horrific stalemate, which was only broken when the U.S. got involved in 1917.
And that moment, the U.S. entry, that's really where this moralistic mindset that we're, kind of stuck in today starts to take root.
Yep.
You have Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and he's aiming for a war to end all wars.
Right, something much bigger than just balancing power.
So much bigger.
Yeah.
He had his 14 points, promising self-determination, free trade, a collective security system. But the treaty that came out of it, the Treaty of Versailles, it failed because it was just fundamentally contradictory.
How so?
Well, on one hand, it was talking about self-determination, but it completely ignored the calls for decolonization from places like Vietnam and India. But the fatal flaw, the really big one, was the punitive terms against Germany. They were financially ruinous.
They absolutely were.
Yeah.
Germany was left just crippled by debt, and it quickly turned into this international financial house of cards.
Right, because Germany was supposed to make these huge reparations payments, but they could only do it through the Dawes Plan of 1924, which was financed by massive private loans from the U.S.
So U.S. money goes to Germany.
Germany uses that money to pay Britain and France, who then use that same money to pay back their own war debts to the U.S. It was this perfect, fragile circle. And when the U.S. stock market crashed in 1929, the whole cycle just seized up.
So the U.S. financial system, through these private loans, was literally propping up the entire post-war peace in Europe. When the Great Depression hit, it took the political order down with it, and that directly fueled the conditions for World War II.
Yes. And here's where the distortion we see today is born. When the U.S. emerges from World War II victorious, it comes with this political story that its global primacy is a force for virtue, a total moral break from the greedy empires that came before.
The narrative becomes that the U.S. is the democratic hegemon by accident, by moral necessity. It was destined to rescue the world.
But as the sources make crystal clear, this is an empirically incomplete moral vision. It's a convenient myth.
It is. It ignores how much the U.S. benefited from the war, and it ignores that in many ways the U.S. acted just like the empires before it. But that myth is still structurally intact today. It's what fuels the hawkishness, the moral certainty, the extremism that sees China not as a complex competitor, but in these stark black and white terms.
Those versus evil.
Exactly. A binary where GPC isn't just necessary, it's morally required for America to survive.
Let's dig into the Cold War then, because that's the historical analogy that policymakers just keep coming back to. After World War II, Stalin's refusal to honor the Yalta agreements on Eastern Europe, it genuinely baffled U.S. policymakers. They needed a framework to understand what the Soviets were doing.
And that's where George F. Kennan comes in.
That's where Kennan comes in with his long telegram in 1946. He lays out the theory of containment. He argues the Soviet Union is inherently expansionist because of its ideology, and the U.S. has to adopt the strategy of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment. And that becomes the blueprint for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan.
So using economic aid to stop Europe from falling to communism.
Right. But the strategy takes this hard turn. It becomes much more militarized after 1949 when the Soviets test their first atomic bomb, and then 1950 you have the Korean War, and the communist takeover of China is a done deal.
And that's the pivot point.
That's the pivot point towards militarized GPC. You get policymakers like Paul Nitze and Dean Acheson, and they push for this dramatic policy shift called NSC 68. They argue that economic and diplomatic power, it's not enough. The U.S. has to build up its military, conventional, and nuclear dramatically. The goal for them was a preponderance of power, not just matching the Soviets, but rolling back communism everywhere.
And that sets up this first big paradox. The U.S., trying to prevent global annihilation, ends up compounding the risk of a global nuclear war.
The fear was just palpable. Once the Soviets had the bomb, the arms race became this exponential nightmare. The U.S. went from having fewer than 300 nuclear weapons in 1950 to over 18,000 by 1960.
18,000.
This grotesque buildup leads to the logic of mutual assured destruction, Mad D, where the only safety is knowing both sides can be completely annihilated.
And this nuclear era gives birth to what C. Wright Mills called the military intellectual complex, the whole ecosystem of think tanks and academics advising the government. Places like RAND.
And figures like Henry Kissinger, who in 1957 in his book argued for the selective use of nuclear weapons. I mean, this wasn't some fringe idea. Defense intellectuals were actively pushing the concept of limited nuclear warfare as a viable policy.
These wizards of Armageddon.
The wizards of Armageddon, yeah. They were trapped in this mindset where abstract strategy just completely trumped human reality. They were assuring President Eisenhower that this unprecedented type of war could be managed, it could be calibrated.
And that paralysis carries right into the Kennedy administration, right? Fueled by paranoia over this made-up missile gap with the Soviets.
It did, and it led to massive increases in defense spending and this proliferation of war games. Economists at RAND, like Thomas Schelling, they pioneered these game theory simulations, forcing policymakers to play out these theoretical conflicts to find a path to a U.S. victory.
Which, ironically, only seemed to confirm how bleak the reality was.
It just made it feel structurally inevitable. The simulation was meant to reassure, but it terrified them.
And then, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and all the academic theories come crashing into the real world. Khrushchev puts nuclear missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy's advisors are just flooded with advice.
And the overwhelming consensus from the military hawks, people like Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief, was just unrelenting force. LeMay famously called the naval blockade a pretty weak response. He compared it to appeasement at Munich.
And the national security establishment really believed that, right? They thought the Soviets were going for global military dominance.
They genuinely did. But what's so often forgotten today is that the crisis itself was basically precipitated by years of U.S. provocation. I mean, the CIA's repeated attempts to overthrow Castro, to assassinate him, it was predictable blowback.
And when they tested the war games against the real crisis, they just fell apart.
They proved unrealistic. Despite all this hawkish pressure, Kennedy ultimately pulled back from ordering an airstrike. And the resolution that saved the world, it didn't come from military brinkmanship. It came from back-channel diplomacy.
Khrushchev reached out privately.
He did. And the crisis was diffused by a concession. The U.S. publicly promised not to invade Cuba, and this is the key part, secretly agreed to pull its Jupiter missiles out of Turkey.
So the forgotten lesson there is vital. The arms race wasn't the future. The crisis proved the hawks wrong. It showed the profound value of cooperation and concession.
It led directly to détente, to the Limited Test Ban Treaty in '63, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in '68. That history of mutual restraint, the only thing that actually saved us, is just systematically ignored today in the rush back to rivalry.
Okay, let's turn to the second paradox then. Democracy versus domestic repression. Or, as you put it, peace for whom? Because while the U.S. and the Soviets avoided blowing each other up, the Cold War was anything but peaceful for the rest of the world.
The numbers are just horrifying, and they're so often overlooked. The historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain estimates that over 20 million people were killed in Cold War conflicts. That's about 1,200 people a day, every day, for 45 years. And the vast majority, 7 out of 10, were killed in the Global South, in Asia and Latin America, in proxy wars that were fought specifically to avoid a nuclear war between the superpowers.
All justified by the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, all its neighbors will follow.
Right, and President Eisenhower basically gave CIA Director Alan Dulles a free hand to run the agency with almost no oversight, focused entirely on these covert interventions.
And the examples of that blowback are just staggering. Let's start with Iran in 1953.
The CIA engineers a coup against the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. And what was his crime? He nationalized Iran's oil production. So the U.S., motivated by oil and Cold War fears, installs the Shah,
who then bans political parties, creates a brutal secret police,
and arrests, tortures, and executes thousands of political prisoners. And the long-term consequence is undeniable. The Shah's oppressive rule leads directly to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which still defines U.S.-Iran hostility today. We literally created our own enemy.
And it was a similar story in Guatemala in 1954.
Very similar. Dulles orchestrates a propaganda campaign to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, whose government wanted to redistribute land from the super-powerful American company, the United Fruit Company. Arbenz gets replaced by a military dictator who murders thousands of suspected communists.
And then there's Vietnam. After the French were defeated, the CIA props up Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam.
They pour in cash to rig the 1955 referendum, giving Diem this absurd 98.2% victory. His regime was brutal. He used these agrivilles, which were basically concentration camps for peasants, all in the name of fighting communism. And when he became too much of a liability, the U.S. greenlit his assassination in 1963, which of course did nothing to stop the slide into the Vietnam War.
The political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke looked at this and concluded that these covert regime changes, they just weren't effective. They weren't the cheap fix policymakers thought they were.
Not at all. They often led to even more instability, which then demanded more expensive, overt military action later on. It shows the U.S. government, in the name of spreading democracy, was responsible for a whole litany of human rights abuses.
But the paradox got deeper right here at home. The popular memory of the Cold War is all about, technological progress, the civil rights movement, but the reality was much more repressive.
In the name of anti-communism, the U.S. waged a war on political and economic democracy at home. A really shocking example is the GI Bill. Black Americans were technically eligible, but they were actively shut out of the economic mobility it promised through systematic redlining by banks and real estate agents.
And the growth of the military-industrial complex made that inequality even worse.
It did because policymakers strategically moved defense contracts out of the industrial Midwest and into the rural South and West, into areas where whites were the dominant racial group.
And the jobs themselves changed, right?
They did. The shift to super expensive high-tech weapons like ICBMs and satellites meant defense jobs needed advanced degrees. So there were fewer low-skilled factory jobs for Black Americans who'd face systemic educational disadvantages. The sources point to places like Levittown, Long Island, where white skilled workers got secure defense jobs, but Black workers were almost entirely excluded.
And at the same time, anti-communism became this horrible license for repression against civil rights leaders. J. Edgar Hoover as FBI director.
Hoover made it his personal obsessive mission to destroy Martin Luther King Jr.
I just want to pause on that. The government security apparatus was actively trying to destroy one of its most prominent citizens.
Absolutely. Hoover saw King as a clever subversive, an American Lenin. He used the Cold War wiretapping system to constantly monitor King, gathering compromising information, and then he tried to use that to blackmail King, to force him to commit suicide. This was all justified by the imperative of anti-communist GPC.
And the whiter red scare just decimated the political left. Mainstream groups like the NAACP felt they had to publicly denounce their leftist allies, which basically killed the Popular Front's vision for a multiracial economic democracy.
The Cold War ended up controlling the pace and the nature of progress. After Brown v. Board, school desegregation became the dominant issue, but the sources point out that integrated schools were actually pretty low on the movement's original agenda.
So it diverted energy from other things.
It diverted energy and attention away from fundamental issues like economic justice, high-paying union jobs, affordable housing issues that are still not fully resolved today.
And this repression wasn't just aimed at Black activists.
No. After the Chinese Revolution in 1949, McCarthyism specifically fueled this racialized idea that Chinese Americans were an illegal and dangerous fifth column, as the historian Man Guy documented.
And finally, what about gender roles?
The Cold War reinforced them. World War II had pulled millions of women into factory work, but the post-war consensus pushed them back into the home, emphasizing their role as consumers. The good wages that the unionized working class got depended implicitly on keeping women out of the workforce, which limited their autonomy.
Which is what led directly to Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique.
Exactly. The conclusion is pretty inescapable. Anti-communism had these disastrous repercussions for Americans at home. It actively held back racial and economic equality. There was, I guess, one minor silver lining. Soviet propaganda would often highlight Jim Crow to criticize American democracy.
So it forced U.S. policymakers to at least acknowledge racism, to make some surface-level changes.
Right, to neutralize the Soviet attack line. But if rivalry with the Soviets was, in some flawed way, a means to an end, rivalry with China today often feels like the end itself. The justification for competition, just stopping China's rise, has become the sole, all-consuming goal.
Okay, so let's move into the post-Cold War era. The Soviet collapse is immediately framed as this unambiguous American victory.
Total triumphalism. You get the declaration of the end of history, the belief in this enduring unipolar moment where the U.S. has no conceivable rival.
And this myth that the U.S. had just vanquished its foe through sheer virtue was just too powerful to resist. It set policymakers up to assume this role as the unchallenged global leader.
But critically, it encouraged them to completely abandon the restraint that had defined the period after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And this is where we miss this huge opportunity, the peace dividend.
A massive opportunity. Initially, there were serious calls for huge defense cuts. William Kaufman, a longtime defense intellectual, wanted to cut military spending in half. Even former Reagan officials agreed it was warranted.
But the policy goal just shifts on a dime. The 1992 Defense Planning Guidance, the DPG, it asserts this radical new position. It says the U.S. must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor.
So it formally enshrines the goal of primacy, unrivaled American dominance, even when there was no pure threat. The policy was now explicitly about preventing the world from ever balancing against the U.S.
And what happened to that peace dividend under the Democrats with Clinton?
Under Clinton, it was largely used for deficit reduction. Activist groups were pushing hard for a comprehensive strategy of economic conversion, to help the millions of laid-off defense workers to transition defense plants to civilian use.
But Clinton refused.
He did. He was driven by fiscal conservatism, and he didn't want to do anything that would compromise America's ability to patrol the globe. The economic interests of defense contractors were prioritized over the workers.
And what about China in the 90s? Clinton's strategy seemed kind of contradictory.
It was. He often embraced this democratic peace theory, the idea that if you just trade more with China, they'll inevitably liberalize and become a strategic partner.
But that view got a major reality check during the 1996 Taiwan Strait confrontation.
It did. When China launched missiles near the island, it gave the PLA, their military, a clear reason to start modernizing its forces, specifically to counter the U.S. in any future crisis. But even then, the U.S. still basically saw China through this optimistic lens.
And then 9/11 happens. And that just immediately interrupts this return to great power thinking.
The focus shifts entirely. China becomes a temporary partner in the fight against terrorism. The U.S. adopts the revolution in military affairs, model light footprint, precision strikes, information supremacy for asymmetric warfare.
So things like balance of power and nuclear parity become irrelevant when you're fighting non-state actors.
For a few years, yeah. The probability of a great power war just completely faded from view. But it's important to remember that the Bush administration had actually come into office with a much tougher stance on China, seeing it as a strategic competitor.
But the war on terror just threw that plan out the window.
Completely. The U.S. became obsessed with revenge and ambitious nation building. They were talking about a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, trying to build a democracy from scratch, and that shifted China from an enemy to a vital partner in this global struggle between civilized states and terrorists.
Then the invasion of Iraq in 2003 just consumes all of America's resources and attention for years.
The administration expected a quick victory, shock and awe, but the war just spiraled because of this profound hubris and massive mismanagement.
The decision by Paul Bremer to disband the entire Iraqi military.
A catastrophic decision. It created massive unemployment and led directly to widespread violence.
Yeah.
The dream that U.S. power could just easily create a stable, democratic Iraq just evaporated.
And the cost of that preemptive war went beyond just lives and money. It cost the U.S. its international credibility.
It really did. And the sources highlight this incredibly prescient warning from the French president, Jacques Chirac. He publicly asked, if the U.S. can take preemptive action against Iraq based on a perceived threat, what if China claims Taiwan is a similar threat and takes preemptive action against it?
After the Iraq debacle, the Bush administration had to be more cautious with China, simply because they didn't have the resources to fight on two fronts.
Exactly. And China, very smartly, just avoided getting entangled.
Okay, so the definitive shift back to rivalry. The catalyst wasn't a military event. It was the 2008 Great Recession.
The financial crisis, yeah. It exposed this fundamental fragility in the U.S.-led global economic order. As we talked about, the U.S. need for military superiority created this constant need to borrow money from overseas.
That capital flow bonanza.
Right. And this glut of cheap foreign capital led to reckless lending, asset bubbles, and banking crises all over the world, which hurt the most economically insecure people the most.
And China saw this self-inflicted American weakness.
They did. Confident in their own state-run model, China started to assert more global influence. They even publicly suggested creating a universal currency to replace the U.S. dollar. It was a clear signal of their ambition.
And U.S. policymakers took note.
Immediately. The 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review was the first major official document to express concern that China's economic growth, plus its military power, was a direct threat. They were really focused on China's development of what they call A2AD anti-access area denial capabilities.
So weapons designed specifically to keep U.S. forces out of the Western Pacific?
Precisely. And the official turning point comes in 2011 and 2012. Osama bin Laden is dead, the war on terror is winding down, and the U.S. strategy officially rebalances its military resources to the Indo-Pacific.
That was the definitive return of the peer threat. It let U.S. strategy retreat back into that comfortable but dangerous historical binary. Democracy versus autocracy. The messy, hopeful post-Cold War era was officially over.
And rivalry was once again the organizing principle of American power.
Let's shift our focus then to the consequences of this renewed fixation on GPC right here at home. The authors make a powerful case that this rivalry is actively poisoning American politics.
The main domestic result is the creation of this almost absolute bipartisan consensus on confrontation. The China threat is one of the very few things left in Washington that Republicans and Democrats agree on.
And that consensus means both parties can use it to justify huge budgets, more surveillance, policies that might otherwise get a lot of pushback.
Right. As one Republican congressman reportedly said, China is a key part of the new conservative movement. So GPC isn't just a foreign policy, it's a domestic political tool.
A tool with a very dark consequence. It fuels extremism and xenophobia. Having this named external foreign enemy in the public imagination makes people far more receptive to the preachers of hate and conspiracy.
And the most immediate evidence was the COVID crisis. When the pandemic hit, Republican leaders didn't just criticize China's response, they called for a full-scale anti-China assault over its origins. Trump cemented it by constantly calling it the Chinese virus.
And it got even more alarming. Far-right figures started distorting domestic social movements through this same lens. The sources talk about Steve Bannon claiming that the defining issue of 2020 would be confrontation with the CCP.
He went so far as to make the absolutely outlandish claim that the CCP was responsible for George Floyd's murder.
That's an incredible leap. How do you even connect those dots?
It was a calculated strategy. That narrative, often paired with these false right-wing memes about Floyd dying from fentanyl bought from China, it was designed to subvert the Black Lives Matter movement. The goal was to redirect all this legitimate domestic anger by linking it to a foreign communist enemy, to frame the struggle for racial justice as a foreign plot.
And this anti-China atmosphere revived these incredibly painful racialized stereotypes against Asian Americans, just like in the McCarthy era.
It absolutely did. The sources highlight Senator Josh Hawley campaigning on slogans like, "Stop helping the Chinese buy our farms." And crucially, Hawley was the only no vote on the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act in 2021.
So it shows that using anti-China fervor to justify xenophobia is now a political platform.
And the suspicion has been directed at public officials, too.
Yeah.
Other Republicans have openly questioned the loyalty of Chinese American officials like Representative Judy Chu. It's a disturbing return of that fifth column suspicion, the idea that all Chinese Americans are somehow agents of a foreign power. The rivalry provides a license for institutionalized racism.
Okay, let's talk about the economic peril. This is maybe the most profound domestic impact, the way the rivalry is dictating economic policy. The Biden administration, to its credit, acknowledged the failures of neoliberalism.
Right, which always put capital ahead of workers. So they proposed this new economic statecraft focused on national security, relying on huge legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the PS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Law.
And this new approach is being called national security Keynesianism.
That's what analysts are calling it. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, called it the new Washington consensus. But it repeats the fundamental mistake of the early Cold War. It links American prosperity not to the well-being of its own citizens, but ties it structurally to the existence of a foreign enemy.
And this approach is explicitly punitive. It's not just about making the U.S. stronger, it's about actively kneecapping China.
Precisely. U.S. industrial policy is designed to deny China access to advanced tech, especially semiconductors, to weaken their economic and military growth. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was very blunt about it. She admitted they needed to deny them this technology that they need to advance their military.
So this punitive focus, this goal to maintain as large of a lead as possible, it just fuels Chinese nationalism and makes them more belligerent. It turns economic policy into an act of aggression.
And China's foreign ministry has already called the U.S. investment controls technological bullying, which just immediately ratchets up tensions and introduces this profound instability into the global economy.
And all of this competition ensures that resources just keep flowing, maybe unnecessarily, to the military-industrial complex. The defense budget is just soaring. It's closing in on $900 billion a year.
Some estimates put the total defense spending, when you factor in everything else, at over $1.5 trillion.
And that massive amount of spending is just structurally inefficient as an economic driver.
It is. The sources cite Brown University's Costs of War project, which found that for the same amount of money, you could create twice the number of jobs in healthcare or education as you can in defense. Defense is capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. It's an inefficient way to create broad prosperity.
So who does benefit from this national security Keynesianism?
Primarily high-skilled, high-wage workers, the upper middle class, the focus on advanced tech like semiconductor manufacturing. the benefits just disproportionately go to this professional class.
Let's look at those semiconductor numbers. 90% of all advanced chips are made in Taiwan. And the biggest company, TSMC, only employs 65,000 people globally.
Right. And despite these massive government investments, over $200 billion, those are projected to create only about 82,000 jobs. It's a negligible impact on national unemployment relative to the huge public subsidy. The focus is on industrial capacity and denying China, not on broad economic uplift.
Meanwhile, the legislation didn't even roll back the decades of neoliberal policy. The key labor supports in the original Build Back Better Act got stripped out.
And so the IRA relies mostly on corporate tax credits instead of mandated requirements that would favor workers. And the investments are flowing through these tax credits to conservative, non-union right-to-work states. This is the big, risky wager of the so-called battery belt.
They're betting that unionization will just follow the money.
But it's a bet that maintains the fundamental power imbalance between capital and labor. And the China threat is actively being used by politicians to undercut labor demands. We saw a really stark example with electric vehicle manufacturing.
With Governor Youngkin in Virginia.
Absolutely. He rejected a bid to build a huge Ford battery plant, claiming it was a front for China and a Chinese communist intrusion. It's a clear case of using xenophobic nationalism to kill a massive economic opportunity just to undercut labor.
And the same tactic was used during the UAW strike in 2023.
It was. Republicans like Mike Pence and Josh Hawley openly opposed the UAW's demands, arguing that boosting wages for EV manufacturing somehow strengthened China. They framed workers' demands as a threat to national security. It's a direct echo of how the Red Scare was used to pass the Taft-Hartley Act and neuter worker power in the 1940s.
Okay, let's look at the global economic threat. The U.S. insistence on military superiority is fueling instability worldwide.
Because that constant need for deficit financing for foreign borrowing, it creates these huge imbalances. By exploiting its position as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, the U.S. sucks in massive amounts of foreign capital.
That capital flow bonanza again.
And that leads to asset bubbles and banking crises everywhere, which disproportionately harm the economically insecure in developing nations.
And finally, the rivalry just completely warps our response to the existential climate crisis. Biden's budget prioritizes the Pentagon at almost $860 billion a year. And the Pentagon is the world's single largest greenhouse gas emitters. We're actively empowering the most environmentally toxic part of our economy.
And by filtering climate policy through the lens of China rivalry, focusing on making batteries in the battery belt, it falls short of the global scale that's actually needed. The IRA promotes a green transition, sure, but it also allows for more oil drilling permits to appease fossil fuel interests. The national security focus just obscures the planetary scale of the problem.
So let's turn to the final part, the global peril. How this rivalry fundamentally threatens peace and stability. The sources argue it compels the U.S. to emulate the worst habits of the Cold War.
It forces the U.S. to prop up autocracies just to counter China, which basically revives the spirit of the Reagan doctrine. And that creates these massive moral double standards that just completely undermine U.S. credibility.
And the relationship with India is the perfect, striking example of this. The U.S. has embraced India as this critical strategic counterweight to China.
Yet, India's internal crackdowns are severe. They revoked Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy. They sent in 35,000 troops. They imposed martial law. The sources argue this violence is arguably more severe than what China did in Hong Kong in 2020.
And how did the West respond to those two comparable actions?
China got immediate condemnation and sanctions. India got U.S. arms in a high-profile White House summit. This selective moral outrage, driven purely by geopolitical rivalry, shows that U.S. policy is sacrificing its stated principles for geopolitical advantage.
And that leads to self-defeating strategies. When the U.S. supports repressive governments just to impose costs on China, it inadvertently makes Chinese aid and influence more attractive to developing nations who don't have other options.
As James Baldwin said during the Cold War, the only real advantage Russia has is the moral history of the Western world. Today, American moral sacrifices in the name of rivalry create the conditions where Chinese influence, offered without lectures on human rights, becomes an essential alternative.
Okay, let's look at the military dimension. This is where the danger is most acute. China is undeniably expanding its military, especially its navy and its nuclear arsenal.
And the biggest flashpoint is still the Taiwan Strait. U.S. strategy insists on keeping a favorable imbalance of power there, a decisive military advantage, even though China has huge geographical advantages. The U.S. drive for primacy, not just deterrence, is what's jeopardizing the stability that already exists.
And this brings us right to the security dilemma. Let's just define that clearly for everyone listening.
The security dilemma is a core idea in international relations. Actions that one state takes to increase its own security, like building more missiles, are automatically seen as a threat by its adversary.
So the adversary, China, responds by taking countermeasures, which then reduces the security of the first state, the U.S., and the whole cycle just spirals. It's an arms race fueled by mutual fear.
Exactly. So policies like proliferating weapons to allies like Australia and Japan, or building more bases, they escalate the security dilemma, but they can't solve it. It's self-defeating. The current situation has been stable because China is still deterred by the immense cost of an invasion.
So Xi Jinping's rhetoric, dare to fight, that's more of a political statement.
The sources argue it's an expression of jingoistic resolve, not a signal that China is about to launch a preventive war. Which is why they conclude that military restraint should be the priority, because the competition is what puts the existing deterrence in jeopardy.
And finally, there's the global debt crisis.
GPC profoundly affects this. U.S. protectionist measures, they undermine the export-reliant economies of dozens of other nations, especially in the global south.
So the U.S. is tearing down the old economic structure without offering anything new to replace it.
Precisely. And in a time of sputtering global growth, this keeps developing states dangerously reliant on debt, a lot of which now comes from China through things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
And the consequences are dire. As of 2022, 60% of low-income countries are in severe debt distress. They're spending twice as much on interest payments as they receive in new loans.
Many governments are spending more on debt service than on healthcare or education. And the default international response from the IMF just makes it worse. For every dollar the IMF gives for social spending, it requires that country to cut 4 times more through harsh austerity.
Which destabilizes potential U.S. allies and creates the perfect conditions for more Chinese influence.
The U.S. rivalry, in this case, actively feeds the very influence it claims to be fighting.
So after all this, what does it all mean? This deep dive has shown that great power competition, which is sustained by this, airbrushed heroic view of history, it sacrifices American democracy and economic equality for a really questionable geopolitical advantage. The rivalry isn't a means to a better world. It's become an end in itself, one that inherently increases global risk and domestic inequality.
The logic we hear all the time, that xenophobia and inequality are just these unfortunate problems, necessary costs to achieve the national interest, that fundamentally violates what good strategy is. A national security worthy of the name has to reflect the needs of all Americans, not just the military, industrial, or professional classes.
And the authors propose a clear alternative, a path that rejects primacy and instead pursues a stable equilibrium in what is now a multipolar world. This requires 3 key shifts.
First, we have to prioritize war prevention over war preparation and stop pretending that the latter is the same as the former. Second, we need to embrace what they call associative balancing cooperation between regional actors in the Indo-Pacific instead of forcing this rigid U.S.-defined competition.
And third, adopting military restraint requires a kind of intellectual honesty. We have to honestly connect U.S. actions to China's responses. We have to constantly ask ourselves, to what extent is China just reacting to what we're doing?
If those questions were approached honestly, the answers would lead directly to military restraint and a less aggressive posture. A durable security doesn't let fear become fate. It demands a less romantic, more critical view of these struggles.
If that's true, then here's a provocative thought for you to consider. What domestic, economic, and climate commitments could the United States fund? I mean, a truly bold vision for a green transition, for climate adaptation aid, if it cut just 2% of its military spending annually, as a group of Nobel laureates has suggested. The resources are there, but the rivalry prevents us from even seeing them.
Indeed. We look forward to hearing what possibilities you uncover.
Until next time, keep digging.